This is a fictional cipher from a Sherlock Holmes story. And this is Amharic, a real writing system used by over 50 million people across the Horn of Africa. At a glance, they trigger the same intuition. But this dancing script isn't fiction at all. It's the protagonist of one of Africa's most intense geopolitical dramas, about empire, resistance, and algorithms that couldn't keep up. So how did a sacred writing system become a tool of empire, and later, a blind spot that helped fuel real-world violence? For over a century, this script was the infrastructure of power for Ethiopian emperors, a tool to consolidate authority across dozens of ethnic groups speaking 80 different languages. Today, it's a flashpoint. In the Oromia region, a generation rejected it as colonial. During the Tigray War from 2020 to 2022, hate speech flooded social media in this script, and Facebook's systems were effectively blind to it. In 2021, whistleblower Frances Haugen told the United States Senate that the platform was fanning ethnic violence in Ethiopia. The reason? Their AI couldn't parse the dancing script. This is the story of how a writing system became a gatekeeping mechanism, a shield, and a digital blind spot. In the next 10 minutes, we'll decode how these dancing figures actually work, trace how emperors weaponized this script to build an empire, and uncover why Silicon Valley's most powerful tech companies couldn't moderate hate speech in a language spoken by tens of millions. Let's begin with the dance itself. Most writing systems you know are alphabets. A represents one sound, B another. Amharic doesn't work that way. It's an abugida, a syllabic alphabet where each character represents a consonant-vowel combination. Take the consonant B. In Amharic, that's pronounced be. Now watch the dance. Need boo? The right arm stretches out. Want B? Add an ankle bracelet to the right leg. How about ba? The left leg shortens. Need bay? A small loop appears at the bottom right. Want bit? A flag salutes on the left shoulder. And bow? The right leg shortens significantly. One base shape, 7 systematic modifications, 231 total syllables across 33 consonant families. It's not chaos, it's elegant mathematical choreography. This script wasn't invented for everyday communication. It was born sacred. 1600 years ago, the kingdom of Aksum carved these characters into towering stone obelisks. The script recorded Ge'ez, the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, Ethiopia's equivalent of Latin. For centuries, writing in this script wasn't just communication. It was a holy act, reserved for monks and scholars preserving scripture and royal chronicles. Amharic, the language of the Amhara people in the Central Highlands, inherited this script around the 13th century. What was once the language of God slowly became the language of kings, and eventually of empire. Amharic sounds unlike any European language. It features ejective consonants, sounds produced by closing your glottis and releasing air sharply, creating an audible pop. English speakers often can't hear the difference at first, but to Amharic ears, confusing these sounds is as jarring as mixing ship and sheep for English speakers. This phonetic complexity adds another layer of exclusivity. Learning Amharic isn't just about memorizing shapes, it's about training your throat and tongue to make distinctions that change meaning entirely. But Amharic's most celebrated feature isn't written or heard, it's hidden. The highest form of Amharic poetry is called sem'ena work, literally wax and gold. The wax is the surface meaning. The gold is the hidden critique or praise buried inside. Imagine a poet praising a king's generosity while simultaneously, through wordplay and double entendre, mocking his greed. Only the educated elite catch the insult. This tradition gave Ethiopians a survival tool under authoritarian rulers, a way to criticize power without losing your head. But here's the paradox. This linguistic elegance, this cultural richness, would later become justification for imposing Amharic on millions who never asked for it. To understand how, we need to travel back to the age of emperors and rifles. In 1270, the Solomonic dynasty was restored to power in the Ethiopian highlands. Amharic became known as the Lisan Negus, the language of the king. For centuries, it remained largely confined to the royal court and the Amhara heartland, while Ge'ez dominated religious and administrative writing. But in the late 19th century, everything changed. Emperor Menelik II had a vision: unify the fractured highlands and expand south into Oromo, Sidama, and Somali territories. His tool of conquest wasn't just the rifle, it was the script. As his armies swept south, he installed Amharic-speaking administrators called Neftenya, literally rifle bearers, into newly conquered regions. Amharic became the language of government, trade, and modernity, especially in the new capital, Addis Ababa. To participate in the Ethiopian state, you learned Amharic. To resist it was to remain outside power. Menelik's successor, Emperor Haile Selassie, took centralization even further. Between 1930 and 1974, his government pursued aggressive language policies critics called Amharization. In 1944, he decreed that all missionary schools must teach in Amharic. In 1955, the Constitution declared Amharic the sole official language of Ethiopia, no exceptions. Students who spoke Oromo, Tigrinya, or Somali in school were punished, sometimes beaten. Families were pressured to adopt Amharic names for their children to access education and government jobs. The message was clear: to be modern, to be Ethiopian, you must speak Amharic. For the Amhara elite, this was nation-building. For millions of Oromo, Somali, and Tigrayan people, it was linguistic colonization. And when Haile Selassie's regime finally collapsed in 1974, the resentment didn't disappear, it simmered. In 1991, a coalition led by Tigrayan rebels overthrew the military dictatorship and introduced ethnic federalism. The 1995 constitution was revolutionary. All languages would enjoy equal state recognition. Regions could choose their own working languages. Schools could teach in local languages. This looked like a clean break with the past, but it wasn't. Amharic remained the working language of the federal government. And in Oromia, the country's largest region, the Oromo people made a radical choice. They dropped the Ge'ez script entirely and adopted Qubee, a Latin-based alphabet. For the first time in Ethiopia's modern history, millions of children were learning to read and write in a script that looked like English, not like the dancing men. To older Ethiopians, this was heresy. To young Oromos, it was liberation. By 2016, a generation of Oromos had grown up literate in Qubee, but alienated from the federal government's Amharic-dominated bureaucracy. They called themselves the Qubee generation. When protests erupted across Oromia over land grabs and political marginalization, language was central. Signs were in Latin script. Slogans rejected not just government policy, but the script itself, a symbol of imperial domination. The protests eventually brought Abiy Ahmed, an Oromo speaker, to power in 2018. But the linguistic fault lines didn't heal. If anything, they deepened. And when civil war erupted in Tigray in 2020, Amharic became, once again, central to conflict, not on the battlefield, but on Facebook. On October 3, 2021, former Facebook employee Frances Haugen sat before the US Senate and dropped a bombshell. She testified that Facebook was fanning ethnic violence in Ethiopia because the platform lacked the tools and personnel to moderate content in Amharic and other Ethiopian languages. And this wasn't happening in a vacuum. During the Tigray War, hate speech flooded Facebook. Calls for ethnic cleansing, celebration of massacres, dehumanizing propaganda. Facebook's AI, trained overwhelmingly on English, Spanish, and a handful of other languages, simply couldn't parse the dancing script. The company had almost no Amharic-speaking content moderators. Posts that would have been instantly flagged in English circulated for days, weeks, even months. And when users embedded text into images, memes with Amharic captions, the AI was completely blind. The dancing script that once encoded sacred knowledge now encoded hate, invisible to Silicon Valley's algorithms. Now let's talk about why this wasn't an easy technical fix. Start with the basics. An English keyboard has 26 letters. An Amharic keyboard needs to access 231 syllables. On a smartphone screen, that's a nightmare. Most users rely on transliteration keyboards, typing Latin characters that auto-convert to Amharic. But that makes the text harder for AI to analyze, because the input and output don't match. Then there's optical character recognition, teaching computers to read text in images. English OCR is nearly perfect. Amharic OCR, especially in low-resolution memes, fails constantly. The characters are visually complex, the stroke differences subtle. Add internet slang, code switching between Amharic and English, and regional dialects, and you have a linguistic environment that demands massive investment. Facebook didn't make that investment, neither did Twitter. The result? A moderation vacuum at the exact moment Ethiopia needed it most. This wasn't just a technical failure, it was a geopolitical one. Amharic, with over 50 million speakers, was treated as a minor language by platforms built in California. Meanwhile, Icelandic, with fewer than 400,000 speakers, received better moderation tools. The pattern was clear. Western languages got resources. African and Asian languages, even those spoken by tens of millions, were often afterthoughts, and the consequences were measured in lives. Researchers documented how viral Amharic posts coordinated mob violence, spread disinformation about atrocities, and incited ethnic hatred. Facebook eventually hired more moderators and improved its tools, but only after international pressure and investigative journalism exposed the crisis. For Ethiopians, the damage was done. The dancing script had become an instrument of asymmetrical visibility, not because of what it encoded, but because of what Silicon Valley couldn't see. So where does this leave Amharic? It remains Ethiopia's federal working language, spoken by over 50 million people as a first or second language. In the diaspora, from Washington, D.C. to Toronto to Tel Aviv, it's a lifeline to identity. In Ethiopia itself, it's still the language of government, higher education, and national media. But it's also contested, seen by some as unifying, by others as oppressive. The Qubee generation continues to resist. Tigrayans remember how the script carried hate during the war, and tech companies are still catching up, slowly building the infrastructure to moderate, translate, and process a script that predates Silicon Valley by 16 centuries. Amharic's story is a reminder that language is never neutral. It encodes power, history, resistance, and identity. When we started, I showed you two scripts and challenged your intuition. Now you know, Amharic is far more than dancing stick figures. It's a writing system forged in the sacred halls of Aksum, weaponized by emperors to build an empire, resisted by generations seeking autonomy, and overlooked by algorithms that couldn't see its complexity. It's a script that holds the prayers of millions, the propaganda of tyrants, and the protests of the marginalized. And it's still evolving, still encoding the story of Ethiopia in every kick, every loop, every dancing character. If this video changed how you see language and power, consider subscribing for more deep dives into how linguistics shapes geopolitics around the world. Until then, remember, every alphabet is a political choice, and every script tells a story about who gets to speak, who gets heard, and who remains invisible. Thanks for watching.